I'm a writer. I know dialogue.
That's a fountain of conversation, man. That's a geyser.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Yes, provocative.
Oh, Daddy, stand back, man.
Woo! Rock and roll!
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. I'm Eric Senich. Make sure you go to bookedonrock.com to find every episode in audio and video, exclusive video highlights, a blog, links to all of the social media sites, and also get the latest rock book releases at bookedonrock.com. It's another chapter in the dialogue series, a chill and chat with authors, fellow podcasters, musicians, and more. My guest is Jeff Goebel. Jeff is an accomplished guitarist who performs about 200 gigs a year with multiple bands, including Retro Rock Revival, Plan B, and the Huntsville-Alabama-based Van Halen tribute band Forever Unchained. Jeff is a huge Van Halen fan. He's the host of the show Van Halen Stories on his YouTube channel, Final Resonance TV. He's also a fellow contributing writer for the Van Halen News Desk. We talk about our love of all things Van Halen, Jeff's YouTube channel, some of his favorite guests, his thoughts on Alex Van Halen's recent book, Brothers, other books on rock he's read and would like to see someday written. So let's get to it. Here is Jeff Goebel. Jeff, thanks for being here.
Man, it's great to be with you, Eric. We actually just did a podcast, what was about 2 months ago?
That was a marathon. That was like a 3-hour talk about Alex's book with Chris Gill and Brad Talinsky.
Yeah.
So I wanted to return the favor and have you on to talk about Van Halen. Yeah, man, we'll talk about books. We'll talk about Alex's book, of course. Before we get into all of that, tell us about yourself. You're originally from Alabama?
Well, my parents, actually I was born in Illinois. I was born outside of Chicago, and then we moved down south in the 70s. My dad came down for work, so I ended up bouncing around between the southern states, Georgia, South Carolina, and then eventually in Birmingham in 1980. So then I've been here ever since, but Birmingham most of the time. And then I moved up here in 95 to Huntsville area.
Okay. What turned you on to rock and roll and the guitar in particular?
Well, we all know what that is.
The man, King Edward.
Eddie Van Halen, right. Don Kirshner's rock concert one night on my little 20-inch TV. The Unchained video, that series of videos came on that night. Specifically, Roth came on first with his interview with Jim Ladd. So I'm all about that Jim Ladd interview. And
that's the one in his backyard in Pasadena.
Right. Yeah. So, now having any, appreciation for the history of all that and the photography from Niels Lozauer, his shots there and all that, at the house, I got a lot of appreciation for that interview in that backyard of David. So, yeah.
Niels Lozauer, man, he is the man when it comes to photography, especially with Van Halen. Have you had Neil on your show?
I have, yeah.
Yeah.
He was early on, yeah. He was great. I loved Neil. And I actually went over to his studio in Hollywood after that and hung out with him a little bit and almost ran into a famous baseball player.
Really? Who?
Randy Johnson. The
sure.
pitcher. All right, Randy Johnson was in there before me, and I didn't know it.
Wow.
I just missed him.
You wouldn't have missed him. He's tall.
Right. But he's a photographer as well, and so
I didn't know that.
And a drummer. So Randy's a big music guy. So yeah, he was at Neil's place getting some prints, and I just missed him.
What was the first Van Halen song you ever heard?
Unchained, I guess. I mean, Unchained, but I had heard Beat It prior. So it was actually right after Beat It that I saw that video. So as a kid, I was aware of the name Eddie Van Halen, but I hadn't seen him yet, because of the fact you just didn't see it that easily. And you didn't, maybe you just didn't get the exposure unless you happened to pick up a magazine and it said Eddie Van Halen on the front, right? I had heard about him from friends, through Beat It, through the solo there. Somebody said, this is Eddie Van Halen. And I go, who's Eddie Van Halen? And then this came on TV, this Don Kirshner's thing. And then I realized this is the guy that they were talking about, Eddie Van Halen. This is the Beat It solo guy. I connected.
That goes against Alex's comments of why he didn't want Eddie to do the solo on Beat It, because he thought should have had the reverse, should have have Michael on our album, but don't go on his. But yet the argument against that is that people discovered Eddie and then eventually Van Halen through that song.
Absolutely I probably would have seen that night anyway, but it connected to me enough when they said Van Halen when they were going David Lee Roth of Van Halen. And then I started watching it because I heard of Van Halen through the Beat It situation. Yes. So then I stayed on the channel and watched the rest of it. That pretty much made it happen for me.
What was the first guitar you ever bought?
Well, my uncle had one, and I used to steal it, and borrow it in my room. He used to live with us sometimes, so I had one there that happened to be around. And so as soon as I saw Eddie Van Halen, I was messing with it. But I ended up getting an Ibanez Roadstar 2 for Christmas in '83, and that was my first guitar, which happened to have those Super 80 pickups, which are the pickups right after the ones that people think were in the Shark, potentially,
Yep.
the Super 70s. So I do still have that guitar, actually.
All right, first song you learned to play.
Well, on guitar all the way through.
Yep.
All the way through was Paranoid of Black Sabbath.
That's a good one.
Yeah, and then I guess, I learned like the riff to Smoke on the Water, of course, and anything I could pick out by ear, at first.
Sometimes you get people that will just know Eddie as, or they view him as the guy who could just play a bunch of notes. And I would say there's so much more to him than that, especially if you listen to his complete body of work. I guess the first question is, well, what drew you to him about his playing?
My uncle took me to see bands when I was in my teens, before I had this exposure to Eddie. So I saw Bad Company live. I saw Cheap Trick. So when I heard Eddie, I knew he was different than all those other people. It just struck me much differently than those other bands. And for some reason, I guess it was his, the ferocity of his playing at the end of the Unchained video, just that whole cadenza at the end where he just lets loose, which for me was my Eruption, because I didn't hear Eruption yet. This is my first discovery of him. So I hadn't go back to get the album to hear Eruption. I guess maybe I had heard it on the radio, maybe, but I never had connected it. So to me, that moment at the end was the first time I'd heard that kind of aggressive, super fast, accurate playing.
That's the word, though, ferocious, ferocity. That word always comes to mind. I was actually coming up on YouTube, just the algorithm brought me to, surprise, surprise, Van Halen. It knows I like Van Halen. And it had a performance from 93, I think it was the 93 tour of Judgment Day.
Yeah.
And the ferocity in which he's playing on that track. There's so much energy coming through him into that guitar. And there's just something different that separated him from everybody else of his genre. And there's so many good ones. And you've had some on your show. I mean, you've had some great guitarists, but there's just something about him that always stood above all the others. For me personally, it was just a certain feeling I got to this day. Still, it's the greatest sound that I've ever heard, the sound of Eddie playing guitar.
There's something about guys like George Lynch or Hendrix, that they have a breadth of techniques and a large wide style. You know what I mean? With so many different facets. And I think with Eddie, he had so many facets that we heard as we went through the albums. Each little solo thing that he did was like another facet of his playing, and you constantly discovered more and more about him and how deep he was as a player. So I think that was part of, like, he was different than most people. They had a few things, but he had just, it seemed like endless things to show us.
As a guitarist, what makes him so special as far as technique wise?
Well, it's the combination of, one thing I will say is, like, when I saw him live not long ago, a while, the last tours there, probably 2007 or whatever, I was fairly close, and I just remarked to my wife afterwards, I said, when he does it, it just looks so easy, and he is so in it. I think that's, like just the way he transmitted his love and the ease that he came across with. He didn't seem like he was ever struggling, which is really unique with guitar players, because as guitar players, we're almost always struggling.
But as we know, when he was younger, he was constantly playing and constantly working on his craft.
Sure.
Stories of Alex going out to a party here and there, but Ed was just going to stay at home and tinker away at the guitar.
Yeah, I think that's a common theme. I think that I didn't realize that about Eddie as I was becoming a player, that he had gone through that exact thing that I had gone through, which was I got really inspired. Like, for him, it was Clapton, but for me, it was him. So we go through this period where you're really so into it that you just lose all time and space, and you eat it a lot. You just eat it night and day, and it's not work, like Steve Vai always says, or even Eddie, that it wasn't really work for them to do that, practicing that, rehearsing that, that's what he loved to do. So yeah, Alex was out doing his thing, but Eddie was really loving what he was doing while he was doing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I say that about Alex, but Alex worked hard too. It's not like he didn't.
Yeah.
That's the thing, man, that those two guys were in that studio all the time. It's like they lived in that 5150 studio. There are three factions of Van Halen fans. There's the Dave era only fans, the Sammy era only fans, and then there's the fans of all eras. I'm an all era fan. What are your feelings on the two eras of Van Halen, Dave years, Sammy years?
I mean, I love Sammy Hagar. Let me just say that right out of the gate. And the last tour that he just did was fantastic. It was beautiful.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that.
I loved it. So we can talk about it more later. But, I grew up on the Roth era, so I was really into the Roth, the way he played during that period, and Roth's creativity as a lyricist. The lyrics themselves and the melodies were quite different, less melodic than Sammy, I guess is the way that I would describe it, but very super unique. So when Eddie and Sammy got together, I was kind of like still into heavy rock. I was at that point, I had grown up with a steady diet of Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Black Sabbath, Van Halen, AC/DC. So by the time we hit 86, that melodic approach, while I liked it, was not as heavy as the other bands that I was used to listening to, and Van Halen for that matter, because Van Halen was a pretty heavy band in those earlier years, right? So they as a lot of people say, they kind of almost, I don't know if they did, obviously somebody like Priest was a metal band, but Van Halen bordered on that, but with melodic tendencies and all this harmonies and all the things that they did that was different. So that kind of, when he made that transition with Sammy, I kind of was, as a player, was more focusing on harder rock at the time.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
I think you'd be glad later if you weren't here now.
When I first heard that he was a fan of Eric Clapton, and read it in a magazine, I believe, somewhere, I didn't make the connection. But then as the years went on, I listened to more and more of his work during the Sammy years. I think I see it more or hear it more.
Sure,
like in When It's Love on the solo, Eddie himself said, that's my Clapton right there. That's my Clapton moment with that solo. But is that surprising that Clapton was the guy and not Hendrix?
I mean, it was probably, years ago to me, but, now I'm so jaded. But yeah, I thought it was a funny thing that happened in both interviews with Alex and with Eddie, when Eddie was interviewed at the Smithsonian. Jeff and I were both there. When the lady said, she insinuated that he was influenced by Hendrix, when almost all of us out there knew that was not the thing to say.
Ooh, yeah, exactly.
Right.
Because he did not really like Hendrix all that much.
No, he would always say he didn't get it from Hendrix. But I guess when you look at how he innovated with the whammy bar and kind of did just a general, we were talking about ferocity or out of control, wild kind of style, that was really kind of Hendrix thing too, for his time. And so making that comparison to Clapton and trying to connect Clapton to that is kind of hard. Most people wouldn't see Clapton, like you said, as the guy. If you were just Joe Average and you watched Hendrix and you watched Eddie, you would say he was much more like Hendrix than he was like Clapton.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. So most people would make that conclusion. Yeah.
You mentioned Jeff Hausman, you're referring to, the publisher of the Van Halen News Desk. So we want to say hello to Jeff. Shout out to him.
Jeff.
Yeah. What's the most difficult Edward Van Halen song to play?
Man, there's a lot of people. Most people say "I'm the One" is the hardest one to play.
Because I've heard "Summer Nights."
Yeah, it could be. In a lot of ways, because "Summer Nights" is tuned with a Steinberger, right? So if you're trying to play it like Satriani did, you had to play it in a weird position on the tour. And I had learned that back when I was in high school at the time, '86. I think the swing in Hot for Teacher and the swing in I'm the One is the one that's most unnatural for most people, because most people can't do that swing feel like they could. And that was one of their real strong points. So for me personally, it's those two songs that to try to get that feel is, everybody says it's almost impossible. It's pretty hard.
Yeah.
Very difficult.
What about the supporting players? Because every time I would see Eddie play with other musicians, like he would sit in on some jam session, maybe on Letterman or whatever. Not the same as when he's with Alex,
Sure.
with Michael, with Dave, with Sammy. Yeah, especially Alex, because they were just locked in.
Right. At every NAMM show, that would happen. They would have those jams during that period, during the 80s, mid 80s through, I think the last one that Eddie was involved in was 92.
Just never felt it didn't seem like he was totally comfortable playing with anybody but Al.
He never, yeah. I mean, when
never felt right.
I was at those things, I always felt like, like he was doing it because it was just something he was expected to do, and he was going to try to please the people. It's a loose jam, but I think that he had the whole expectation thing on him his whole life. If you go back even through some of my interviews, the people that knew him felt like that he was kind of a sensitive guy who had a lot of pressure on him, and which led to all the other bad things that happened to him. But
that comes through in the book Alex wrote.
Sure. And he does say that in there, and finally kind of confirms that for all of us, that Giles Obrecht had said in my interview that he thought Eddie was the most sensitive person he'd ever met, and that he chose the wrong profession.
Wow.
That's what he said. Jazz was the first guy who ever interviewed Eddie Van Halen. So knew him from the very beginning before he was anybody.
Right. Cause he was supposed to interview who was the guitarist that Jazz was supposed to interview, and it didn't happen. So he sees Eddie on the basketball court backstage at some festival, and
snorting whiskey and cocaine guy. What's his name?
Yeah, we'll think of it.
I'll think of it.
But yeah, from
Pat Travers.
Pat Travers. But from a musical standpoint too, it's just like he, rhythmically wise, he was just locked in with Alex too. It was like he was in the pocket every time he was playing with Alex. And Alex, during those solos, that interplay between the two is fascinating.
It is.
What about Satriani's job playing Ed's licks on that Best of All Worlds tour this past summer? Because that became the subject of a lot of discussion. They showed up on Howard Stern's show without rehearsing, I think, at all. And I think Satriani was saying later, like Sammy was just like, nah, man, let's just do it. We'll be fine. Yeah, and then he was a little rough. He was trying to play Summer Nights, and everybody was criticizing him. What are your thoughts on how he ended up performing those songs?
Well, that Howard Stern thing, he got thrown into the fire. It was kind of unfortunate, and and as a professional guitar player, you understand how that is. Not to be prepared and then have to try to pull something off like that. None of us can really understand what that's like to be at Joe's level and on that show with that many people viewing him. So that was a sort of a bad thing for Joe, but he got out of it. Joe's super cool, and he's super relaxed and
handled it so well.
He did handle it so well. And then when he went out on tour, man, it was fantastic.
I agree. I like he stayed true to Eddie as far as like the bones of the song, but then he put his own signature style on the songs as well, which I think I prefer that over you. It would be kind of disrespectful to Joe to ask him to be like a cover band guitarist.
Sure. I mean, it's not a tribute band.
Right.
I mean, whenever we go out on do a tribute show, you try to do it as accurate as possible, but a lot of times, and a lot of guys that do tribute stuff like Frankie Lindia or whoever, they still do themselves a little bit in those shows. They still have that element of there's me underneath this, this
right.
Other
The personality comes through.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to this song. I think they got one song I know that they've recorded, and we're going to hear it soon. They recorded with Sammy.
Right. I remember seeing that.
Yeah, it's not Jason Bonham on drums. It's Aronoff on drums and Satriani. Right. I'm really looking forward to that. Our guest is guitarist, YouTube host, and contributing writer for the Van Halen News Desk, Jeff Goebel. So let's talk about your show, Van Halen Stories. This can be found on your YouTube channel, Final Resonance TV. What are some of your favorite interviews?
Well, I mean, I like them all, and the reason is that they're all part of a big story, right? The story that I have been trying to get to, though, is a little bit more along the lines of what Greg Renoff did in his book. Greg and I are good buddies. We go back right to when his book was released. I interviewed Greg in one of my earlier podcast series called Musical Journeys, where because I was a big fan, I just really wanted to get a chance to sit down with him. And we met up in Oklahoma at Kane's Ballroom, which was one of the first tour stops for Van Halen. And we sat on the stage where Van Halen played that show in '78 at Kane's Ballroom. I believe it was with Montrose that night. And Journey was off, or Journey was doing another show, or they were off, one or the other. So anyway, that interview really set me up for Van Halen Stories, and my relationship with Greg has been part of in the background. We've always kind of worked together on guests because Greg's focus was the history of it, right? And I've kind of wanted to blend a lot of what Greg did into podcast form with people that he interviewed. So he would connect me with some people, and then I would reach out to other people that are not necessarily in that group of people. And it became a blend of like early days people, contemporaries, journalists, people who just worked with him, knew him, knew the brothers, knew all the band. So it's become this kind of a mix of period history, and that's kind of what the journey is. It's kind of on and off of this Pasadena thing, right? But also mixed in with stories like, from Mark Kendall, who was actually there at the time back in the day, but also a contemporary out in Great White during the 80s. And then you have, people like the guys who grew up with him, like Carl Jaw and Gary Putman, who were in Dred Zeppelin in the 90s, but also grew up in the backyards with Van Halen and had all these stories that were amazing. So, yeah. And of course, like George Lynch was on, and George was there too, but also a contemporary. So it's really cool to have these varied guests.
Those are amazing stories. I had Mark Kendall on, and he was talking about he lived basically down the street, and he saw them playing at a junkyard.
Yep, that's what he said.
$1 to get in, right? Yeah, that's right. I watched that interview. You did a great interview with Mark. It gives you a great look at Eddie and his development. A lot of people would assume that maybe he was doing all those things with the finger tapping right away. He was not.
No.
When did that start?
That's the craziest thing that we kind of like everybody's talked about. I'm in the circle of people with Chris Gill of just like super fans. Phil X is one of the people in that circle. We talk to him a lot. We share like things all the time about all these stories. And there's that period though, and I would say Greg probably was the first one to kind of, maybe Steve Rosen and Greg both had a part in kind of uncovering the timeline of the tapping and all of that. But it seems like that happened within the last year before, 77 to the record, right? People were saying mid 77 is when he started it.
Some say he was at a Zeppelin show and saw a Page. He said that, but what I'm saying is when he started to develop it and became the thing that we heard on the first record was like mid 77. Somebody saw him in the clubs doing it. And then by February, when the record came out, we heard it as a whole thing. So you're talking about a year and a half, maybe, or less. Less than a year. You basically mid 77, then we hear the record in February. So I don't know how much he had before, but it seemed like the developed version we knew hit in mid 77 and then came out on the record. So how far before that was he doing a little tap or, doing something behind his back, turning his back? And it's kind of hard to say, but I believe that mid 77 thing came from a few sources, one of them being Steve Rosen. But Rosen saw him in mid 77, and that's what he said. Okay. Bottom line is he picked up on that and just rapidly improved to the point where, like you say, just from a year, maybe even less before that first album comes out, he's starting to incorporate those into the songs in the studio. It's amazing. Absolutely.
Yeah. Amazing. And there was like a whole, if you go back and listen to all the bootlegs, you'll hear that progression all of a sudden switch from the guy we hear on the record, right? And you'll hear all the stuff before. There's stuff from high school all the way up through that, and there's this point where it all of a sudden all intersects, and there's not just tapping, there's harmonics and the bar more and all of those things all kind of happen. But that's the same kind of thing where he was developing the Frankenstein guitar and the whammy bar, right? So he was getting that at the same time as he was getting the tapping, and it seemed like a myriad of those ideas came together at one point to give us that 78 Van Halen. Whereas if we had had him in 76, it'd have been a totally different guy.
Is Van Halen 1 their best? Is it Fair Warning? Is it 1984? Is it something during the Sammy years? I mean, what do you think is...
That's a tough question.
It is a tough one.
Obviously, I have a soft spot for Fair Warning because,
Yep.
My handle years ago when we were doing like all these forums, there's a forum called EddieVanHalen.com back then, and my handle was Forever Unchained. I don't know if it's 1981 then, but it's Forever Unchained, and that became my Instagram. Is my Instagram today, Forever Unchained 1981. And so, at first I thought I really want to celebrate 81 on that, but it's become kind of a deposit for every kind of weird oddball photo you can think of that we've ever seen, But for the records, God, man, first album and Fair Warning, that's a draw to me.
If you were to ask Eddie, he would say Fair Warning. Like that was the ultimate representation of who he was and who he felt the band was. That was where he finally got a chance to express himself completely, or he did get his own studio, 5150, and I think you could say that more for 1984. But that was where he was finally able to do some more things like sneaking into the studio with Don Landy and doing some stuff without Templeman there and Dave there.
Sure. 84, obviously 84 was kind of a culmination, for as Alex kind of says in his book, that was for him, that was the culmination kind of their desires to get certain sounds, to come across a certain way, all of that kind of came together for him then. But, Eddie, like you said, 81 was when he really got to kind of experiment a lot, and some of his most genius work, from a musician standpoint. That's why musicians and guitar players always go back to Fair Warning, because we're listening to it as a musician, listening for the unique lines and, things like Dirty Movies, this crazy descending line and songs like you have Mean Streets and you have Unchained, which are just these amazing songs, but you have the entire album littered with different types of material that just center swing, say, something like that. I mean, it's just so different.
Booked on Rock Podcast will be back after this.
Oh, just in time for lunch.
Lizzie Hale from Hailstorm was just saying, and I put the article up on VHND the other night about her saying that Women and Children First, best Van Halen album, period, as she put it, quote unquote. And you could make an argument for that too. I mean, a song like
Romeo's Delight.
That is one of my all-time favorite Van Halen songs. Sail away with someone's daughter. Better save the women and children. I mean, that's Dave's influence on that.
Sure. Yeah, and even Eddie liked it. If you read back through some of the books, Eddie talks about that session and how it was Dave's idea, but he enjoyed that cover.
Could this be magic? I don't know why.
Yeah. Could this be magic?
So
he also enjoyed the fact that his father played on Diver Down, and he enjoyed that whole song, Big Bad Bill.
Yep.
Yeah. And so that's something that to me made Van Halen so different, was they could do a Big Bad Bill in the middle of, everything else that they did. And I'm the one. I mean, I'm the one in a Big Bad Bill and a Could This Be Magic? I mean, this is a band that's totally different than any band that we've ever heard before. You think of any of the bands from that period in the metal genre, you're going to kind of hear a similar style per song. It's going to be sort of down one lane, where Van Halen's not in any lane ever.
Yeah, which is why I say to people, you got to hear the whole body of work. A lot of songs that they've heard on the radio, but you really got to listen to the complete albums one after the other. That was a great time discovering Van Halen for the first time, just getting each album. I'd go to Strawberries Records and get a few more cassettes, get Van Halen 1 and 2. Next time around, Women and Children First, Farewell. I go chronologically because I discovered them in 88 through 5150. It was Christmas Eve of 88, and then You Hit One Too, but then it would go back and collect them all. And if you could only go back to that, because you can only experience that once, hearing those albums for the first time.
Right. I was just thinking about what you were saying, because it started out for me hearing the song on Don Kirshner's Unchained, right? And so here I go to the music store to find it, right? I kind of remember what the name of the song was, right? But I have no idea about anything else. Remember, this is like we don't know anything but what that one thing we saw or heard on the radio. You walk in the record store, you start flipping through the records, and you don't even know which one it is really, unless you kind of if. And I was kind of like, do I? Is it? Where's that song? Right? And I'm looking at and I couldn't find it, man. And I flipped over the back of what I know is Diver Down today, right? And on the back are pictures from the Fair Warning tour.
Yeah, opening for the Stones.
Right. So I'm thinking to myself, this must be the album. It's the pictures that match the video. And of course it's not. but I stick it on and it, you get, where all the good times going out of the gate, that swell and just the whole vibe, man. I was like, wow, this is a pretty cool record too, and then I went back.
It really, it's that moment of hearing Eddie for the first time and those songs for the first time. You're like, what is this? Right. What am I listening to? My older brother, he said, I said, oh man, 5150, who are you at 1-2? And my older brother's like, okay, you need to hear this. He had 1 and 2 on vinyl. So we dropped the needle and he goes, this is Van Halen, and that was just like that moment of whoa. Speaking of 1984, you were at the location for the Hot for Teacher video. That's maybe my favorite video that you did. What are some of your standout moments from those episodes? Because you did a lot of on-site videos.
Yeah, I did this. I call it the Van Halen Trails, what I first called it. I started going to Pasadena, man, like to see these sites probably 15 years ago, really, before almost when Facebook was in its infancy. And I was doing some videos back then of these sites. And so as this whole thing kind of developed, I thought, with Greg in my kind of liking of the history, and now we're vlogging and we're doing podcasts, it seemed like I should document these places again and keep finding new ones. And so out of those places, you've got the Van Halen where they wrote their name on Allen Street next to the liquor store. They actually wrote it twice. Most people don't know that, but people see the one where it's written and it's clear and it just says Van Halen, right? But down from the one that says Van Halen, there's a greened over spot where they wrote Van Allen or Van Halen or something like that. Because it's on Allen, right? And they wrote that. And then if you go look around, there's somebody wrote put 78 in the. And if you really look around, you can see Rudy's name. Rudy Lyran, and from the early days. Then I went up to all the parks where they played. You see those pictures of them playing in parks.
Yeah, because there were pictures in Greg's book about
Victory Park.
Period,
remember, Alex talks about the fight that broke out, right? They're in his book. That is at Victory, I believe, it's a little ways from, it's Hastings Ranch, I believe it is. And it's up in one of the neighborhoods. It's kind of just up there. It's just a big, super flat area up there. And apparently they used to have all their little get-togethers out in these places. Like they were like football fields almost. And they're just wide open spaces.
Is Walter Mitty still around?
I don't think that is.
I doubt it. Because that would be a cool place to check out, but it's probably...
Yeah, and what was it we were talking about when you were talking about Mark Kendall? That was that place I had that was so popular back then that they all went. George Lynch went there. I can't remember right off the top, but it's a church now. It's still around, but it's a church.
But those are like Walter Mitty's is one of those hole-in-the-wall bars that Van Halen played in those early days.
Whiskey's probably the only place that stands out to me as a place that still exists.
Yep.
Around for them.
You were at the site of the famous parachute entrance by Van Halen at Anaheim.
Yeah.
You've been by Eddie's childhood home a few times.
Of course.
And what's amazing to me about that is that it's still there and it looks it's pretty much identical. I don't even know if they even painted over the damn thing. It's the same. And I think maybe it was in your video where they were saying that if you were to look inside of the garage, I think you could still see some of the spots where Eddie was spray painting.
Black overspray and red overspray. Yeah, there were pictures that cycled years ago. I want to say 15 years ago, there were photos inside of it. where you saw the overspray. Now, do we really know? We don't, because Greg said, in his book, or at least with his research, that one or two people had been by the house when he was painting guitars, and they witnessed him hanging them on the clotheslines out back with his mom's laundry.
Wow.
So apparently, that was a thing. And then also, the boiling strings thing, that was also brought up because somebody I interviewed was there when he was doing it.
Yeah. What's that story for those who aren't familiar with that? The boiling strings.
Yeah. Well, it was to kind of like make them stay more in tune. You'd boil the strings to stretch them. And he used to do it on his mom's stove in the kitchen. And Tom Broderick, who was one of their early roadies, but also one of probably their first sound man, front of house man. Tom was there when he was doing this one day, and he said his mom was just kind of standing over there waiting for him to get done with the strings.
What would be a great video is Alex going back to that house.
Right.
Having the owners just say, yeah, come on in, walk through.
Yeah. I mean, what's true about it is it has been walked through many times, because it is a rental, it's not owned.
It's a rental. Okay.
As far as I know now, I did some research on it. I found out when it was sold. As far as I know, it's not been sold again. It was sold from his mom, and I think it was 86. Some of it gets a little foggy, but there's documentation on all real estate stuff, So anyway, it gets sold. It ends up in this rental company. It's still, as far as I know, still part of it. But as they had transitioned renters, people were let in to tour it. Who wanted to?
Well, it really should just be turned into a historical landmark at this point. I mean, it's, it really should be. I think it's a matter of time before that happens.
Well, it's crazy because if you look at what it sold for was like $130,000 back in the 80s. It's worth $1 million now.
Sure. Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
I've seen the future. You know what it is? It's a 47-year-old virgin sitting around in his beige pajamas, drinking a banana broccoli shake, singing "I'm an Oscar Mayer wiener."
If you had to pick a Mount Rushmore of guitarists, you got to pick 4 guys to put up there. You got Eddie. Who are the other 3?
Yeah, that's tough because I'll get a lot of crap for this.
Yeah. Personal favorites.
I mean, personal favorite. Okay, personal favorites. I mean, if you're doing historical and straight up, let's just do it both ways. Straight up historical, Eddie, Hendrix, probably Clapton. That's really hard after that because you got Beck, you got Jimmy Page. I mean, it's hard to give you 4 or 5. I mean, those guys, obviously the first blues guys, Clapton, Page, Beck, Hendrix, and Van Halen for me are the, Mount Rushmore plus 1 or whatever. For personal favorites, now top 4, say, obviously the first 2 for me were Eddie and George Lynch. And I got to tell George that he was, him and Eddie were they were my constant swapping 1 and 2 throughout the period. Like I said, in the 90s when Sammy, or late 80s when Sammy came in, Lynch was making this transition out of Dokken, or actually in 87, they came out with Back for the Attack, which is a very heavy album for them. And then he makes this transition into Lynch Mob, which is even heavier, right? So I'm more focusing on George at this point because of where he's going musically. And Eddie's kind of going this melodic route. So that's why George was kind of they were always kind of like the 2 guys, because when I saw Unchained, I thought, this is the coolest guitar style that I've ever heard, right? And I thought to myself, there's got to be another guy like this, there's got to be another guy. And then I saw Dawkins' video for Breaking the Chains. And that I was like, there's a guy who has a stripy guitar, this time Tiger Stripe, and that sound, that Marshall sound, right? So I started to kind of focus in on those 2 guys. And then later, I became a big fan of Yngwie because he was a game changer as a guitar player. And out of those, let's see, Steve Vai, of course, Yngwie, Gary Moore was big for me, and his
Moore,
there's some guys that I really like Michael Schenker,
yes,
that wouldn't be in your top 10 of normal people's, but they're for me.
Dave has had a lot of great guitarists. Stevie Vai, one of them. Are you a fan of Dave's solo, Sammy solo? How much are you into their solo?
Yeah, I was pretty into Sammy solo. We used to, in fact, part of our show, with the Van Halen tribute was to do One Way to Rock and Can't Drive 55.
Now,
Because,
what do you think of Sammy as a guitarist?
I think he's a great guitarist. He's not an Eddie Van Halen, but he's a good guitarist. Takes great little leads, and they're very melodic. Some of the solos are great that he does live. And I don't know if he recorded those at the time in the 80s because they had Gary Phil from Boston at the time. But Sammy's solo albums, I loved them, and like I said, we play those two songs from. But the reason we play them is because Van Halen did them live. They did Can't Drive 55, and they did One Way to Rock live.
Yeah.
So in our tribute, we
All the
figured
time.
that's okay to play the songs that they played as for them covers, but part of the catalog.
Rapid fire here regarding Van Halen. Favorite Van Halen album? It's fair warning.
Yeah, fair warning.
Favorite Van Halen song?
Unchained.
Most underrated Van Halen song?
Oh God, that's tough. I think Hear About It Later is.
That's a good one.
I love it.
And if you were to introduce someone to Van Halen and you had to start with one song that's like the perfect gateway song that would want them to listen to more Van Halen, what would it be and why?
Well, I mean, I would say Eruption, but that's not really it's a solo, not so much a song. So it's really hard to say when you're trying to sell somebody on Van Halen. But I let my singer who she's much younger, she's in her 20s. And I said, you have to listen to this song. It was the one song I thought she needed to hear, and it was I'm the One.
Wow.
Because I thought,
Yeah.
the breakdown where it goes into the multipolar harmony, the way the swing is, the amazing guitar solo, the final runs he does. It's everything that I love about Eddie Van Halen. I think that's why he just does it all in that song. And
it's in my top 10 Van Halen songs. I'm the
it's a
One
killer.
is one of my favorites. And when they
It's
brought it
such a-
back,
it's-
when Dave returned in 07, it was so great to hear again.
Yeah, just to throw that on her as a deep cut and go, you never heard this, but I want you to hear this. It's such a amazing tune.
I think Unchained would be for me. I'd be like, okay, listen to this. If you don't want to hear more after this, then you might be brain dead because this is Van Halen right here.
Yeah, because I think that you have there's that touch of Templeman, his sort of vision of them being sort of a vocal group, almost like a Beach Boys mixed in. And that's sort of what you get for a minute, or a barbershop quartet in the middle of that break.
Yeah.
And so for her as a singer, I wanted to kind of show her the singing part as much as the guitar part.
What's cool about that? My dad was born in 1939, so he grew up on a whole different era of music, and that was the one song that he took to, and I can't recall if it was on the radio or whatever. I just remember the day distinctly being a teenager, and he goes, "What's that?"
Oh, really?
And he loved it. He loved
Right.
that he connected with that. He goes, "I like that." I like that.
The swing goes back so far, it's not
Yeah.
multi-generate. It goes so back so far in time. That's kind of one of the things that even when Van Halen brought that out, swing was an older thing, right?
Yeah.
And it's to come through their music was such a unique feature.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Be right back with a snack, Jack. Don't go away.
We segue into rock books, and we'll start with Alex's recent book, Brothers. So what are your thoughts on the book?
I thought it had some really good parts in it, especially when it was, for me, as looking into his early days, the early childhood. He mentions the house before the house that you're talking about, which I actually went to on my vlog and showed the kind of the original house they moved into when they came to stay for a little while. It took a couple of years before they ended up at Los Lunas. So there was that house. There might have been another that they rented, but there was the one in particular on Oakland Street, I think it is, in Pasadena, that they shared with other families. It's a fairly large house, but it had like 3 families in it, and they were covered kind of in the back, smaller apartment. So when he brought that up, that kind of confirmed some of the things that I've been researching and that Greg had already researched. He kind of actually addressed some of those things that I had already kind of went and found out through all the different sources in his book. So it was cool for him to kind of like tell those things that I kind of already found out, but were the small details that people don't know. And so that was great to see him do that, talk about the coming over. I thought his book mostly focused on his father You know,
I thought that was interesting. Yeah.
a lot about his father. He didn't so much walk moms. That seems to be a sore point with those two. I mean, I think they loved their mom, but she was tough on them. And I don't know how tough, actually. But there's a lot of, the talking Wolfies behind the music with Valerie. There's this sort of hidden family things that are going on there. I think
Crazy,
dynamic,
right? Yeah, I remember her comment.
right? They don't bring them totally out, but you can kind of connect the dots yourself. Which
Yeah,
is what
she's alluding to some kind of abuse that went on and how that affected both of them.
Well, Alex says it in there, and she called him a nothing nut and whatever. He said that. He said that, of course. But you think of that as just sort of like, something that wouldn't be abusive.
Right.
More like ribbing, than trying to hurt you. And maybe it was just ribbing, or maybe that's just the way his mom was. But as Jazz said, he was a very sensitive guy. As his brother says in the book, he was a super sensitive guy. And so he didn't probably, and I think he mentions that in his book, that he didn't take that well.
Alex always felt like he needed to be the protector for Eddie.
Yeah.
Which I wonder, maybe that's why the Sammy years aren't in there. Maybe because of what Sammy wrote. But everybody's speculating, but Alex has said nothing. He hasn't said nothing other than those are the years that are the most special, that meant the most to me in terms of that was when we were on the rise and we were hungry to make it, and then we made it. So I don't know. A lot of people are just taking it as a slight towards Sammy that he left that out. I don't know what to make of that. I don't know if you can say that.
Well, the brothers, they always felt like Sammy was bringing up Van Halen too much, like he was overplaying that. And, he has been very vocal about his time and talks about Van Halen a lot. And, I never felt like he didn't have the right to go on that tour, this last tour, and because these were his songs. I mean, he was a co-writer, he was a co-member. He saved that band, I mean, to be truthful, to have the kind of success they had a second go round. I think they learned from Sharon how rare that would be, right? Because even though Sharon had his big moments, and Van Halen 3 just didn't work at that time. I mean, there was that other album that's not ever been released that we know about.
The follow-up.
And I've heard a little bit of that, and it's better.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, you got to remember that Sammy Hagar, he overstates it a good bit when he says, I was as big as Van Halen when I joined him.
I know.
Right. Okay. And I sold more records than David Lee Roth. These are clear overstatements, right? So that kind of thing probably rubs people wrong. But on the other side of that coin now, absolutely, who else could have done what he did?
Well, think about when people say, if only with Gary, maybe if they just went out and toured first, then recorded an album, it would have been much better. But I say, well, they didn't do that with Sammy. So in defense of Sammy, they didn't have to do that. He stepped in, they wrote the music, the album went to #1, and there was some kind of chemistry there. Sure. And I mean, he's filling some huge shoes. I mean,
sure. Well, you got to think
Dave
about
was the biggest front man in rock and roll.
And I think the only band, well, there's probably a couple bands, but the one band that really stands out in my mind that had that same transition, who made that almost that same level, but not quite that. AC/DC made that transition.
Right.
Bon Scott and AC/DC were a big band when Brian Johnson had to take over. Were they as big as Van Halen when Hagar? Probably not that big, because Van Halen was one of the biggest bands in the world. I mean, AC/DC was close. I mean, don't get me wrong, but Bon Scott's era, it really blew up after Back in Black. So it's very similar, though, because, I mean, who are you going to get to replace Bon Scott? And Brian Johnson walks in, and you had the perfect storm in both situations to continue these careers. And in AC/DC's situation, they're still going.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? Yeah, they're back out on tour. They've got some dates lined up. They're coming around our way here in New England. It really is amazing.
Yep, I'll be in Nashville for that.
You're going to go see him? Nice.
Oh, yeah.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Think about the future.
So what are some of the other books you've read that stand out for you? You said you've read a few Hendrix books, right?
Yeah, I've delved into his books, some of the different books, all the kind of behind the scene. Again, it's sort of the story of the artist who wants to be the artist and doesn't pay too much attention to the business, and then really falls prey to the substance abuse that to escape it.
Very similar to Eddie, right?
Very similar.
Sensitive guys, very humble, kind of put in
Very-
this position where they're looked at as rock gods and guitar gods, and it's not really something they wanted.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was some history behind Hendrix that I didn't know about, this is something that probably most people don't know about, because it kind of connects to my local scene. We had some promoters in our town called Larry Vaughn and Tony Rufino. Tony Rufino and Larry Vaughn were actually instrumental in Hendrix getting a bigger cut at the door and changing the industry to where the artist had the power on the live shows. I didn't know that, but that all happened around Hendrix and around his tours and around these two promoters. So Hendrix they were able to do some things financially that had never been done. But I think that, you had the handlers around Hendrix, and it's hard to say what happened with Hendrix, whether he really did drink himself to death, more or less, or was other foul play. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's the story. Is maybe because his manager was involved in some dark stuff, and I think that Jimmy was ready to part ways with him, and that they feel like, hey, maybe he orchestrated the whole thing.
Tell you what, I had a chance to sit down with Janie Hendrix, his not his biological, not his biological daughter, but who runs his entire
estate.
Yes, at the NAMM show. I had seen her at a thing in Nashville, and I wanted to talk to her, and I never did get up with her there. And I swear it's the weirdest thing, but I had thought about this for a long time, what I'd like to talk to her about. And I'm at the NAMM show, I'm sitting there in the lobby, and some guy comes over to me and goes, "Do you mind if my lady friend sits next to you?" And I look over, and it's Janie Hendrix. And I'm like, of course not. I said, "I know who you are." And anyway, she sits down. I said, Janie, I said, "I'd love to ask you some questions. You have a minute to talk to me?" And she said, "Sure." So we started talking. My first question was, how come there's never been a Hendrix biopic and his music included in it? I think
right, because there was one that did not have his music, the licensed music in it.
With Andre, was it 3000 or whatever?
Right. I never saw it. I didn't hear good things, but
it was a pretty good movie. But you don't have any music in it. So
but there really should be one like that, like the ones they've been doing recently on Bob Dylan and Queen, etc.
Beautiful, right? Beautiful jobs, right? And Van Halen when it comes time.
Oh, I can't wait.
Right, should happen. So the Hendrix thing came down to the company. They actually were in negotiations to do one. The company that they were working with in Hollywood changed hands to foreign owned, and they were no longer interested in working with the foreign owned.
So it was close to happening.
Yeah. Foreign owned country that is pretty well established in America. So anyway, they made that decision back. It's been a while, I think, but she just didn't know the people. But I think she knew the people in the other situation, and was more comfortable with the deal they were making. And then when it changed hands, she didn't want to make the deal, and walked away from it. And she said, we're about to come out with the Maui Hendrix box set, which we know that when that came out.
Yeah, that's crazy. How many releases have posthumously been released? It's amazing because the guy was only around for a few years. It just was
right. You think
a
about
monster in the studio and on the road performing.
It's amazing, right? Like she was there for the guitars and stuff that year. What she does is she goes out and she partners with Fender, say, to put out a specific Hendrix model that year. Maybe they did a purple Strat one year. They did, of course, the one I just got, which is the Flying V. That was the one that was at that bit, the thing with the Van Halen guitar. Were both side by side at that thing in New York, that Play It Loud exhibition. So yeah, she's always involved in those business transactions and decisions. And we talked about a new park they had opened up for Hendrix in Seattle. And we had a little nice little conversation. It was really cool. And, you know, it's one of those things you just, what do they call it? The power, law of attraction. You like kind of think something and then it kind of like happens, and you meditate on it and it sort of happens. And that's what happened. It was the weirdest thing, you know, maybe, you know, obviously I'm in a good spot to be in the right moment, the right place, the right time, but it's just so weird that she walks right over to me and
That's
down.
great. That's
Right.
great. I envy you. Yeah. His brother is,
Yeah. Leon.
is alive. Yeah. And he's done interviews over the years.
Yeah,
So
yes.
on to books that haven't been written that you would like to see written, and you sent some of your answers my way ahead of time, a Don Landee Van Halen focus book. And I think Greg Renoff would be the guy for that job. No, I know he's working on something. I have no idea. Maybe you know, I don't know.
I don't know.
Okay, because I mean, maybe this is what he's working on. I don't know, because Greg did a great interview with Don, and it was published. But that would be a great book. And then and this would be strictly just the nuts and bolts of these songs and how they were recorded and what went into them. For you guys like you and I would be fascinated with that stuff, man. I would be delighted to have a book like that come out.
I was going to say,
Greg, are you listening? Is Greg listening?
Right, Greg. Yeah. You know, I don't know if I've said it to him in any text or anything, you know, like, you know, I never ask him, are you, but if you are, you know, like, you know, if you were.
Well, and Don doesn't do a lot of interviews. He did one with Greg, so he felt comfortable enough to do that.
I think, you know, the combination that he worked with Ted and that the way that he told the first historical part of it, you know, and his credentials as a history professor, you know, he's the guy to really dig and do the due diligence. And I think that's the attraction to having Greg. I mean, he's a great at that. I mean, that first book, Van Halen Rising, man.
Amazing.
That's like one of my Bibles, you know. Even today I'll go back with this one.
There it is, yeah.
And spend time researching things that I'm working on myself as I go to Pasadena every year. That's become a thing for me. Every year after NAMM, I go to the Pasadena area, stay in town, learn the town to try to understand the depth of it. I was going to say one more thing before you get into the next thing.
Sure.
There is a book that's being written, and I'll give a little short shout out to her name's Fleur, and I can't even say her last name. Fleur. She's from Australia. She's got a book coming out. You might be familiar with her, but she's the girl who did all of the 80s clothing design, including Van Halen.
Oh, I think I know. She's done interviews before, I think.
A little bit of interview, but she's got a book coming out.
Oh, that's great.
And her and I have been talking, and she's going to be on the podcast. I'm pretty sure we almost did it before the end of the year, but they were having some wildfires down in Australia and stuff. She had to get out of there. But basically, she was the one who was responsible for the outfit for physical for Olivia Newton-John.
Wow,
that was her. And she also did Elton John and Rod Stewart. She has a huge catalog of people she worked with. But
so she's got a book coming out.
Yes.
Well, you know, she could come here and
of course
plug that book. She's got an open invite.
Make sure she does. But if you think about Whitesnake and that era of clothing, then you know her style.
Yeah.
Remember that I used to always say there was one clothing designer we all went to? Well, it's got to be her.
It's got to be her.
It's got to be her. So
did Dave work with her? Did David Lee?
Oh yeah. Yeah, she was over at his house. Yeah. But in fact, she's posted her notes from meeting with Roth, and I think even a letter from Roth that he gave her or sent her, because she was called over to his house to, work on design.
The mansion in Pasadena. Yeah.
So she's been there, done that, and she knew Eddie from '78 on, so she knew him early. So I don't know how much detail we're going to get into which outfits she might have been involved in, but I would love to find out where the jumpsuits and all these things were these Van Halen creations or were there somebody else behind it.
Paul Stanley? I wonder if she worked with Paul in the 80s. Okay.
Yeah,
he had some wild ones. Remember was it Who Wants to Be Lonely? That video where he's got the
I swear it's her.
Aqua green and pink and
go look through her photos on her Instagram.
That's awesome.
I'll send you a link. But yeah, it is like It is her career is amazing, and she's gonna be happy to know that I'm talking about her new book.
Nice. Those are the people that have all the great stories that you don't hear enough of. Like
I know.
Like the woman the artist who did the artwork for the 1984 cover. That story. I'm blank on her name right now, but like those are the people that they give you these stories that you don't hear enough about. Like I was over Christmas watching A Christmas Story, and I always say, I'm like, you see that little kid there next to the two bullies with the tall redhead and the little kid there? That's Yano Anaya, and he was the little Michael Anthony in Hot for Teacher. Get out of here, Yeah, and he was also in Better Off Dead. I want my $2.
Wow,
Yano
really?
Anaya, yeah. Let's talk about Dave a little bit more, because you say you would like another book from Dave, but a serious book. "Quote unquote serious." Now, I think I know where you're going with this, because Crazy from the Heat, it's crazy. I mean, it's like you're trying to follow, you're inside of Dave's brain, and it's sometimes you're not sure where we're going. But do you want to just see Dave really put aside the Diamond Dave persona and just get real?
Yeah, because he can. I know he can. I've heard it. People have told me they've had these real conversations with him. Ralph from Steel Panther told me that he was Diamond Dave one time he was with him, and the other time he was regular person Dave. And he can do this. He can be that guy. And there's one clip, I don't know if you've ever seen it, where Dave's showing the cover of the Van Halen 1, and he's talking about it, talking about the images.
From 1991, you talk about? Because
yeah, I think so.
He's leaning on the hood of his car, and he's going through and he's like a grab bag, and he's picking them out. Yeah.
Yeah. So, at that moment, he's actually telling the story about the album cover, where they shot it, the kind of things that we talk about. I know he can do it, but he has to drop into Diamond Dave all the time.
Because there's a side of him, obviously, that Alex seems to appreciate. Because reading the book, it's like, who knew? They're buddies from back in the day.
Right. Well,
and he's the first guy he called after Eddie passed away.
I know, it's crazy.
Yeah.
So you think about that video they made during Different Kind of Truth, where they all sat down and they had those downtown sessions,
Yeah,
right?
it was great.
Right. And Dave goes into all these discussions, including the necklace and the whole, a little bit of the management stuff and their paychecks, and they kind of reminisce. It's a very short thing, but man, there's so much detail that we'd all love to know. Like if I had Alex on, for instance, I would really dig for those things that we want to know. That, I mean, I see those other interviews and I'm like, yeah, but what about
You're so right.
The deeper story? Because you're doing the high level thing, but we want to know the first home details. We want to know about Los Lunas. We want to know what that was like for you guys. What was that neighborhood like? What was that like going to Dave's house the first time when you guys live in this little home versus this gigantic, ginormous mansion? What did you think of David Lee Roth? I mean, obviously they talk a little bit about him in that, out of that context, but were they shocked by his wealth and the difference in their lives?
I wonder too, before these interviews are conducted, are they saying, don't ask him about Sammy? Because they're not asking him. If they do, they kind of word it carefully. Like, I noticed you stop at the year 1985 and say, wait a minute, these guys must be like dying to ask the question, like, do you have a problem with Sammy? What's going on? But they never ask that. It's always worded carefully. So I wonder.
Yeah, as far as I can find out, is it has to do with the whole thing with, we all know the story about how Cabo Wabo changed hands. They sold their share. Sammy took it. It was kind of not doing well. And then all of a sudden it blew up.
Yep.
And they kind of felt slighted by that they might've been used. And I don't think that's what happened. I just think he got better people down there, and timing was right. And for Sammy, it seems like, like a lot of people I know, they're just lucky people. These guys he falls into these wonderful situations.
He said it. Look, guys, I had no idea what was going to happen with this place, because it was on the verge of extinction before all of a sudden it took off.
Well, of course, Cabo's taken off, it took off too. So, I think he just like right time, right place, and then the whole tequila thing kind of came out of different thoughts about, you know how Buffett kind of made his music a lifestyle music, and then Kenny Chesney kind of copied that idea. And then Hagar was like, well, why not me? And it turned out to be huge, you know,
Yeah.
but there was no guarantees any of that would work for him, but it did.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Well, we're waiting.
One last book you'd like to see written, a book from the inner circle of Van Halen with guys like Terry Kilgore.
Yeah.
Which would be great. Terry Kilgore's on Your Filthy Little Mouth by Dave, and that's Dave's solo album, and he goes back to the early days.
Yeah. Terry, we talked about this a lot, but I've been trying to get Terry on. And, I think Terry is like an unsung hero in this story. Just like Chris Holmes is in the background of this detail of Van Halen. There's a few people.
Chris Holmes of Wasp, right?
Yeah, Chris Holmes of Wasp. To me, and to a lot of people that watch, Terry Kilgore and Chris Holmes are the two guys they want to know. They want to know better, and they want to hear their story. And my thing is like this, where you get a little bit of background about me and where I come from. That's what I want to do with Kilgore. I want to get a more detail about when did you start playing guitar? What led you to that place? What was your influences? Was it Cream? Was it Clapton? What was it? And how that then intersects with Edward and eventually ends up with him in Roth's band. There's a wonderful story there that no one knows.
Yeah. And I wonder, I'd love to know what his thoughts are on getting the opportunity to be on an album with Dave, but it doesn't pan out the way it did with previous guitarists. It didn't launch him the way it launched Stevie Vai.
Well, yeah, because
it's just unfortunate because he's a really good guitarist.
But really, that was it. What year was it, though? That was the thing.
94.
Yeah, so there you go. That's when everything just hit bottom with grunge, and it's just that it so fell out of vogue that there was, it's all about timing. We just talked about Hagar. The right time, right place, man. But, even for, it really didn't matter how talented you were as a guitar player at 93, it was done, and Van Halen carefully navigated their way. Like Sammy says, we were scared of Alice in Chains, so he brought them on tour with us so he could gather some of their fans.
They were one of the few bands that survived and thrived along with Aerosmith as you head into the 90s. Like I would say a song like Right Now was a huge moment for them because I think it pushed them forward.
Right.
But then, as we know, by the mid-90s, all that fell apart.
I remember like Bon Jovi was so popular in Europe, that Van Halen opened for Bon Jovi in Europe, right? They had done so well over there. And so when the grunge era hit, Bon Jovi really took a hit, except for a couple of the songs that he did on soundtracks or whatever. Other than that, great songs off that Keep the Faith album, I think was 95.
That was 90. I was in college at the time. So that's 90. Was it 92, 91, 92?
Right in there. Yeah. Right before the change.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Bon Jovi kind of took this downward turn, but Van Halen happened to, like you said, they were able to navigate that period and still keep going, until 98. And, that was just maybe the momentum that carried them, plus the smart moves they made with working along, they were an original. That helps.
Mm-hmm.
So the Aerosmith, Aerosmith was smart, and they started getting outside writers and killing it on MTV, and they got some great actresses on their videos, and including Steven's wife or Steven's daughter. And they made iconic videos that helped, just like they did in the 80s.
Yeah, I remember Bon Jovi, the only way they can get on the radio and on MTV were ballads for a while there.
Yeah, sure.
Strictly ballads. That was, they were getting on the radio stations that were like the light favorite stations. And I was like, wow, this is strange. And then in the late 90s when they had It's My Life, that's made a bit of a comeback as a rock and roll band.
And, look, now they're just, he's still as iconic as ever. It's amazing, like some of the bands that have been able to transverse all of that, AC/DC being one of those bands, Aerosmith up till recently, with the problems that happened. Some of those bands, the originals made it. They made it through it all somehow. And Van Halen did, 2015. They were still out there, and they would still be out there, had we not lost Ed.
Not one Van Halen fan could see what was coming in the second half of the 90s. They were unstoppable. It was like being a fan of the New England Patriots in the 2000s. You just expected them to be number one. You expected them to be the band.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
What happened? Wait a minute. They're not getting along with Sammy? Like they were buds. They were like this all the time.
Right. Yeah, they were like, when they first met, and it was a honeymoon for a while there.
Right.
You know, they were incredible together.
It's like, wait a minute, they're inviting Dave back in? I thought they hated Dave.
Right.
What's going on?
Well, and then Alex's book is just sort of like, like, wow, I didn't really realize he liked Dave that much.
Right.
You said, and respected Dave. I mean, obviously you and I respect Dave. I love Dave.
Loved him. A huge Dave fan. Yeah. Solo with Van Halen.
I can see his, downfalls or maybe they're not downfalls at all, that his personality is so crazy that it's so eccentric that we can't get a straight answer from him. He's the Riddler, he's like,
yeah.
Riddler.
I just wonder, maybe he doesn't think that we would be interested in Dave Roth, that all we want to hear is Diamond Dave, but that's not the case, not for folks like us.
Yeah, there's a video that I don't know how this happened, but of David Lee Roth in his house with I think it's Japanese interviewers, and he's sort of staying in that lane, and he's and there's also a few others where he stays in the lane with like Joe Rogan or whoever, where for a minute. I mean, not the whole time.
Not the whole time.
But here and there.
Where's he going with this?
Here and there, he's a great storyteller.
Yeah.
And if he could just, hone it down. He does try to do it a little bit on his podcast that he does. And I would love to sit down with David Lee Roth and just please, Dave. Let me ask you questions and you answer them.
When he was on Carson Daly in the early 2000s, Carson's like, I haven't even asked a question yet. It was like 5 minutes of Dave just talking, telling stories.
You heard that? You heard the I think it's Jazz's interview with it's either Jazz or Steve's Rosen's, where Eddie says, we don't really want to do the talking, so we just send Dave in, and then he tells him a bunch of stuff that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah,
and he fills up the time, and they just are mesmerized by him, and that he doesn't really say anything.
Yeah,
he keeps them entertained, and he goes, "That's why he's great for our band." He kind of admits it like his brother does, that there was this character in him.
Yes, yeah. So promote whatever you want to promote, the YouTube channel, whatever. You're on social media, so have at it. Let people know where they can find you.
Okay. Well, obviously, Final Resonance TV is my YouTube channel. Van Halen Stories is a podcast that I do. It's a series of podcasts. Been out there this will be the 4th year coming up. Be going out to LA again for another trip to the Pasadena area very shortly.
Okay.
So probably see some content again from the Van Halen trail that I'll try to find some new spots to go to this time. Working my way around. So that's all going to come up. And like I said, I have a couple other things that I'm working on, different interviews that are coming. There's a lot of people in the backlog that I've wanted to get, like Adam Reaver, who's tentatively agreed to be on. Brian Young from David Lee Roth.
Yeah.
All these people I've talked to, and we've, talked about doing it. We hadn't quite firmed it up.
Ray Luzier?
He'd be great. He's in Nashville. Yeah. Yeah. So there's an endless number of people like Nick Bocott, who I just had on. You helped me with that whole thing at the desk. Nick Bocott, if you haven't seen that one, a lot of people think it's one of their favorites. They say that. And Nick Bocott's stories are hilarious. He's English, so he has that humor that's great. Tells some great stuff. So I would definitely check that out. One thing I want to talk about too is about books. One of my more interesting guests, and this is a really crazy story, and I'll tell the story. We call it night. Back in the 90s, I ran across this book. It's called Musicians in Tune.
Musicians in Tune. Okay.
Okay, and it's by a lady named Jenny Boyd. So Jenny Boyd, the history of Jenny Boyd. Jenny Boyd is Patty Boyd's sister. Jenny and Patty are famous Patty's more famous for the Beatles because Patty was married to George Harrison and Eric Clapton, right? The song Layla was written about her. Something was written about her. Wonderful Tonight was written about her. Jenny, her younger sister, was around her when she was part of the Hard Day's Night movie. Right, so Jenny goes off and ends up marrying Mick Fleetwood. And then she becomes a PhD in psychology. And then in the 90s, she does what we do. She interviews musicians about people in the music business, about their processes, how they create. And she comes out with this book, Musicians in Tune. So in the 90s, this is essentially our podcast in the book form. All these musicians, 75 musicians, including Clapton and Harrison and all the people at the time. And Jenny and I reconnected for a book review on my other podcast, which is called Musical Journeys, which sometimes I'll do other ones that aren't Van Halen related, and they go into my Musical Journeys bucket of interviews. And if you haven't seen that one, check out Jenny Boyd from the last Musical Journeys episode, where we talk about this book and what happens. She reissued this book recently in audio form too, with the actual interviews of Harrison. The audio.
How recent?
In the last 6 months. So,
okay, Jeff, you gotta hook me up. Gotta get her on.
Jenny's awesome. Jenny Boyd, it's what's probably the most interesting thing, and it will blow your mind, is when the Beatles went to India. She was in those photos we see of them in India, all together, the whole group together. She's in all those photos with her sister. And she spent time with them as they wrote those songs at that time and experienced life in India. She goes through that with me a little bit in my podcast interview. We talk about Peter Green because she was close to Peter Green.
Oh, one of the best guitar tones in rock history.
So I had to go there, of course, as a guitar player. And we talk about McCartney and all the Beatles and their personalities. And
wow, I got to check that episode out.
Yeah, it's done pretty well. She flies under the radar a little bit, but she became this PhD, and her psychology led her to doing these interviews. And so I get this book in the 90s, right? And I'm like, oh, I'm kind of like these other people. I create the same way they do. I experience the same things they do. These other people in the music business, all types, all levels. So I get into podcasting, right, through my Musical Journeys podcast and Van Halen Stories. And it just dawns on me one day, this lady's probably still alive, and I can probably still get her on my podcast. So I contacted her online, and she agreed. And after 30 some odd years now, I had this book. I had the author finally on my podcast.
She must have been thrilled, though, to know that somebody all these years later got that much out of a book that she wrote 30 years ago.
She did. And so much so that it just so happened that she was reissuing that book at the same time. So it's a pretty cool. So if you look up Jenny Boyd, you can find her latest version of this book in the audio and get it. It's awesome.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Jeff Goebel, thanks, man. This was great to have you on. I'm glad we finally made this happen.
Yeah, it's great to see you again in person.
Yeah,
sort of in person.
Yeah, virtually.
Virtually in person. Yeah, man, we got some interesting stuff coming this year. I can't wait maybe we could do something else. We can do some other, do another dual thing or triple thing with some people.
I'm in, man.
I'm in too. Think about it. You get Alex Van Halen. You call me, I'll give you some questions.
Let me give Alex a call right now. Let's see if he's on.
Right.
All right, Jeff. Thanks, man.
All right, buddy. You have a great one, man.
Well, that was an adventure.
That was quite a show you put on today.
Well, let me just close this conversation by saying you are one unique individual.